Good afternoon, everybody. We are going to get started with our fantastic keynote presentation right now. My name is Stacey Gordon-Sterling. I am the director of the Animal Law Program at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. I want to add my welcome to all of you and to all of you who have joined us virtually today, too. I have the pleasure today of getting to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Marino, who will be speaking on the topic of animal cognition research. The ongoing legal fight for non-human animal rights in litigation, as well as in legislation and policy, is reliant on the strength of the evidence that show capacities of other animals that they're eligible for species-specific rights. And that evidence necessarily comes from the ever-growing dynamic scientific literature on animal cognition and related abilities. And in this keynote address, Dr. Marino is going to provide some examples of how the science of animal cognition has become an integral part of the efforts to recognize legal rights both in the US and in other countries. Dr. Marino is the founder and president of the Whale Sanctuary Project. She was formerly a senior lecturer at Emory University for 20 years and faculty affiliate at the Emory Center for Ethics. Dr. Marino co-authored the first study showing mirror self-recognition in bottlenose dolphins, in 2001. She's been involved with work in dolphin and whale neuroanatomy for 30 years, showing that the brains of dolphins became as complex as those of great apes. So I think she has a lot to share with us. So I am going to turn it over to her.
So thank you very much, and thank you to ALDF and GW and everybody for inviting me to come and speak to you today. I'm just so pleased to be here, and I'm sort of invigorated because I just came from what's called the Hill, Capitol Hill, and a couple of days ago I was there with a bunch of lobbyists from the Animal Welfare Institute, and we were pushing a new bill that I will tell you about. It's pretty exciting. The bill was introduced by Representative Adam Schiff and Dianne Feinstein, and it's a bill that would end captive whale entertainment in the U.S. And I'm going to tell you about that in a bit. But first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about what led to me being on the Hill. And it was the first time I had done anything like that. And it was really interesting. I'm a neuroscientist by training, and I've spent a lot of time studying how other animals think, their level of self-awareness, and of course their brains from in non-invasive ways. And increasingly, the science of animal cognition has shown that most wild animals cannot thrive on display in cages and tanks. And I learned that along with my work in basic neuroscience. And so over the last few years, those two things came together. So that's why I'm not an attorney, but I'm here because I recognize the importance of bringing science and animal law together. So what I want to do is share some exciting news about how science and animal law are working together closely. And I'm going to demonstrate my incapacity to there. Well, this is for me, and this is for you. Let's see. is this supposed to sort of be aimed somewhere? Um, well, let's take two. Sure, no problem. I'm sitting here pressing the button like, a pigeon in a Skinner box. Gives you a chance to eat more. Okay, so here we go. Woo! All right. So I work in mainly two areas. I work in the area of wild animal captivity. And I also work in the area of farmed animals. And here you see three animals that I've studied to various degrees. And of course, the one on the right, the orca and other cetaceans, my specialty. So let's just think about the moral and legal status of other animals. As we know, they're property. They're property. They're like, the tables and chairs in this room. And I work a good deal with the Nonhuman Rights Project, and this is a really telling statement. The legal thinghood of all non-human animals is the single most important factor preventing humans from vindicating their interest. And animal welfare laws are generally weak, and they only apply under certain circumstances, and they actually grant no rights to any animals and maintain the status quo of animal exploitation. It doesn't provide any recourse against the suffering that we inflict on other animals. And so that's why I think that a rights-based approach, along with the welfare approach, is one that is critically important. So when it comes to dolphins and whales, the animals that I've been studying and advocating for many years now, what is their legal and moral status? Well, we know that they have very highly developed capacities, and those capacities are shared with ourselves. They're autonomous beings. And they should be recognized as non-human persons. At the very least, let's think about this, that their well-being as individuals should be respected. But they're still treated as objects, property, commodity. When I did the study on mirror self-recognition 20 years ago, I studied two dolphins at the New York Aquarium, and my co-author Diana Reese and I were able to show that these young dolphins, bottlenose dolphins like this one, were able to recognize themselves in mirrors. And that showed that they have a certain level of self-awareness that's not unlike our own. And then I began to think about what their life is like if they're that self-aware and they're swimming in a tank, a concrete tank, around and around, year after year after year. And then they both died. And it was that moment that I realized that, there's something that has to be done about the well-being of these animals. And I felt a personal responsibility to become an advocate for them as well as a scientist, because I realized then through my studies what their experience was probably like living in that rundown concrete tank. Now, as I mentioned, I like to work in the realm of rights, but I'm aware that rights can mean many things, and there are numerous views and approaches to protecting animals legally. And some of that has to do with personhood, and we'll talk about that this afternoon, right? But there are other kinds of approaches that are attempting to provide rights for other animals. The thing that's clear is that all of these views need to reflect who non-human animals are and what rights should be respected. What are their species-specific rights? And that information derives from the scientific literature. So the task of arguing for other animals really depends upon being able to wield that science, utilize that science in the most effective way so that you can get people to understand, judges, others, to understand who these beings are and what they need to thrive. And I would just make a brief note that science is not the enemy. And a lot of people I speak to, especially those individuals who are working to find alternatives to using animals in laboratory work and basic research, you know, will view science and scientists with sort of a wariness, but it's really not. Science is simply a way of finding out about the world. And it's not the enemy. In fact, it is your friend and can be used against the establishment that uses animals. So there are lots of people in the animal law field who have recognized that science is the base of what they do. As I mentioned, the Non-Human Rights Project, they have claimed that they closely follow the science of who non-human animals are, and I've worked with them for many years. Without the science of who these animals are, they don't have a case. Marianne Sullivan has made the point that science is incredibly important to animal law. Kelly Lavanda from ALDF has said that the U.S. animal welfare laws should be informed by scientific knowledge regarding animals' mental capacities. And Martha Nussbaum has made it a foundation of her platform on capacities to understand what cognitive complexities animals, non-human beings, bring to the table. So science plays a foundational role in animal law and policy. Scientific evidence of non-human animals' cognitive and emotional complexity is vital. So with a project like the Non-Human Rights Project, where they are attempting to recognize the legal personhood through habeas corpus for certain animals, the foundation for those arguments are the expert witnesses and the AFANs. And although they haven't yet won, they've gotten very close. In their first trial for a chimpanzee, there was a very important ruling by Judge Eugene Fahey saying that, and this is Tommy behind bars. We don't know where Tommy is right now. While it may be arguable that a chimpanzee is not a person, there is no doubt that it is not merely a thing. And I help the Non-Human Rights Projects collect all of the scientific evidence from scientists around the world, showing that these beings are indeed highly complex, self-aware beings who have a psychology very much like our own, or rather, we are very much like them. And there was a recent case of an elephant at the Bronx Zoo. This is Happy. And Happy was the first elephant to show mirror self-recognition. She's an autonomous, self-aware being. And although, again, she did not win her case, it was very clear to some of the judges who dissented in this case that this is not an automaton. This is a thinking, feeling, self-aware being, and that the law has to find a way, a mechanism to get to the point where her rights can be recognized and she can be protected. Oops. Now, I work in Canada as well as the United States. And the reason I work in Canada a lot is because the whale sanctuary project that we're creating is in Nova Scotia. And so I've gotten very involved in the Canadian law, Canadian policy. And a few years ago, I was asked to give scientific testimony for the passing of a Canadian bill called Bill S-203, Ending the Captivity of Whales and Dolphins Act. And that passed after almost 4 years of deliberations. It passed in June of 2019. And I was joined by a number of friends in the scientific community talking about the experience of dolphins and whales living in tanks, being put on display, forced to entertain, forced to be bred. And this was a rousing success. So right now in Canada, there's only one facility that has animals that are grandfathered in that are continuing to keep dolphins and whales, beluga whales and orcas, and that's Marineland in Ontario, but they cannot breed. They cannot use them for entertainment. And this kind of progressive legislation really was based in large part on the science of who these animals are, and was able to show that more has to be done for these animals. There's a new bill coming up in Canada called Bill S-241, or the Jane Goodall Act. And this was introduced first in 2020 by Senator Murray Sinclair, who's an Indigenous leader in Canada, and then reintroduced by Senator Marty Klein with endorsement by Jane Goodall. And this act would actually extend some similar, not exactly, but similar protections to wild animals in zoos across Canada. And of course, including phasing out elephant captivity in Canada. And of course, here too, the science comes into play in a very important way. Well, now I want to get to what I was doing here in the Capitol. And I want to tell you about a new act that has just been introduced, and that is called the SWIMS Act, Strengthening Welfare in Marine Settings Act. It was developed by the Non-Human Rights Project and introduced in July 2022. The basis of this is the fact that, as Steve Wise says, the science is clear that species such as whales and elephants chimpanzees, and many others need and want to live freely, just as we do. We believe it's time for the law to catch up. What would the SWIMS Act do? Two really simple things. It would amend the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972 and add the ban on taking, importing, or exporting orcas, beluga whales, pilot whales, and false killer whales for public display. It is already endorsed by several organizations, including the Whale Sanctuary Project. And again, based upon the fact that the science is now unequivocal, that whales and dolphins, like so many other animals, are been shown through peer-reviewed scientific work that they are emotionally and socially and cognitively complex animals. And I was just talking to someone at lunch about culture, and the fact that, you know, the idea of culture in non-human beings was a taboo topic just a few years ago. And now we know that so many non-human species have important cultural traditions, and those too have to be taken into account. They have to be taken into account when it comes to keeping wild animals captive, but it also has to be taken into account when we're talking about the conservation of communities of non-humans in the wild, because culture to some animals, like to us, is everything. We know from a mountain of work that whales and dolphins are able to engage in all kinds of creative problem solving, intentional communication, and they show empathy and complex emotions for others, and they are self-aware. We also know through a series of peer-reviewed scientific studies that these animals cannot thrive in captivity. This is not an issue anymore. It's something that we can point to the science and say, well, it doesn't work. Whale in a tank does not work. And science is increasingly supporting the notion that these species suffer a great deal in marine parks. Yet they are still, according to federal laws, being allowed to be confined and bred in these concrete tanks, where their complex psychological, social, cultural, and physical needs are not being met. So what I think is very important to mention is that all of these exciting developments are coming about because we're starting to use the science to undergird legal efforts. And I'm going to skip through that. And that is where you can find out more about the SWIMS Act. I want to tell you one last thing. And this is about something very, very exciting. And you will recognize this beautiful lady, Kathy Hessler, and at GW. And Kathy and I have been working for the past year and a half on a new initiative. The new initiative brings together animal law scholars, practitioners, policymakers, and experts in both the natural and social sciences. And the reason that we want to do this is because we recognize the foundational importance of science of other animals on animal law. And so if I had to sum up this new initiative, it would be in the question, what can science do for animal law? It's all about, as a scientist, as someone who can provide science to animal law, what do you guys need to do your job better for other animals? What would a legal system properly informed by scientific understanding about animals and the harms of their usage look like? And the goal of this project that I'm working on with Kathy is to create new pathways of collaboration across disciplines that will empower animal protection in all areas: litigation, legislation, policy creation, and education. And we just came back from an Animal Law and Science Summit in Chicago. This was sponsored by the Brooks Institute, where we got together a bunch of scientists and a bunch of animal lawyers, and we sat in a room and we said, what can science do for animal law? And out of that came a series of important tasks that we recognize as being the start of an entire project where science and animal law work together. And I'm very, very excited about doing this with Kathy and all of the other people in our group. And this is something that will formalize the collaboration between science and animal law in a way that I hope, that we all hope, empowers animal law, so that those of you out there arguing for and creating policy for other animals are best equipped to do that. Here's an example, Kathy and I, and you could take a look at this. We have a CLE course out using law and science to help animals. Great fun, an hour, you can get credit for it. And it's sort of an introduction to what we're planning to do over the next few years. So that's sort of a whirlwind introduction to some of the new exciting projects that are sort of on the horizon that I think will continue to empower animal law and policy, and really, I hope, change the landscape in many ways for how we protect other animals. So thank you very much.
Thank you again to Dr. Marino. Our next panel actually begins momentarily, so we do not have time for questions and answers. But Dr. Marino is going to be here for the rest of the day. So if you have some questions for her, you can catch up with her. And she said she would be happy to talk with you. So thank you again for joining us for our keynote panel.